I am Charlotte Casseraghi, and in partnership with the House of Chanel, I present to you the Les Rencontres podcast. As part of the Rendez-vous littéraire at Rue Cambon, this podcast spotlights the birth of a female writer. You can listen to the various episodes and their authors on your preferred streaming platforms.
Happy Saturday. It's September 21st, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And it's been yet another fascinating and unpredictable week in the news. Exciting times in America. This week found Sean Combs and Harvey Weinstein both seated in front of judges in lower Manhattan courtrooms. In the UK, we've discovered that Keir Starmer is not, in fact, a choir boy Michael. He failed to disclose that the multimillionaire political donor and former chairman of ASOS, a fashion chain, bought his wife Victoria about $25,000 worth of clothing last year. We knew there was a reason she looked so good. Meanwhile, in France, there's yet another uproar about a well-meaning initiative from Mayor Anne Hidalgo. Twice a week, one of her new policies means that 51,000 municipal workers are now receiving entirely vegetarian meals in the name of ecology, and nobody is happy about it. Some are even calling it an exercise in political correctness as well as an abuse of power. But as usual, Michael Airmail and Morning Meeting are the antidote to all of that.
Absolutely. We've got a terrific show today. First, Ravi Samaya will explain how a turf war between rival gangs turned Sweden into Europe's most violent country. Then, many of you know the tragic story of Dorothy Stratten, the former actress and playmate who was murdered by her husband in 1980. It was a horrible ending to her life, and this week, her sister Louise will tell her side of the story, including how she came to marry Peter Bogdanovich, who directed Dorothy in her final movie. And then, if you're still trying to understand what exactly is or was a brat summer, you are not alone. These days, so-called vibe trends are increasingly incoherent, whether it is the strawberry girl summer or hot rodent boyfriend. But fortunately, the always wise Cassie David will join us from LA to make sense of all the madness. And finally, students are back in school in the US and the UK, but in the UK, all is not well. The new Labour government wants to hike taxes substantially on the tuition parents pay to put their children in private schools. And my wonderful co-host, Ashley Baker, has her report on whether the proposed tax will level the playing field or maybe just wreck one of the country's revered institutions. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Let's get Cassie David on here because, I think I survived the brat summer, but I'm living in fear of what's coming for me this fall. Cassie David is a writer at large for Airmail, as well as the author of No One Asked for This essays. Welcome, Cassie.
Hello, you guys.
So, Cassie, the internet, social media, it's always been a ridiculous place, but it seems to be getting even more so with these totally absurd trends. Riz, demure, brat. What is going on?
For me, the obsession I'm really talking about is obviously, like, we've heard the word vibes 100 times this year alone, but these like amalgamation of words and then making them into a vibe when there's like really no rhyme or reason to like putting any of these words together is really what's making me feel more insane than usual.
Give us an example.
Like 2 years ago, I noticed that there was mousy brunette girl. And I was like, okay, I kind of understand that. By the way, most of them make at least a little bit of sense in terms of like, oh, you can see that there is a vibe that it's cultivating. But now it's gotten so insane that, obviously I made this chart that you can really string together any 3 words and you can pretend it's a vibe. And I think it sounds exactly like any of the other ones. But I saw one this week that was like College Girl Autumn, and it was using a photo of Rory Gilmore. And like, sure, yeah, she's a girl, she's in college, and it's fall in the photo. But at the end of the day, like, we don't all need to make it a thing, when it's what's actually right there is just what it is. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
From a psychological perspective, like, why do we feel like we have to explain anything? Why can't we just enjoy?
I think people are enjoying it, and that's the problem. That too many people are enjoying this, and I'm really here to just take the fun out of it. But most things on the internet that turn into mainstream, I feel like have to be so dumb in order for it to get that big in the first place. But now it's like all these little ones that are, more micro trends, like the hot rodent boyfriend and all these things that just don't really make sense. And they're kind of just percolating throughout the entire internet. And it's kind of how people talk now. It's just like, that's so girl next door coded, the coded, or like, this is giving this. It's like, everything's about energy and vibes. And it's like, I wonder at a point, like, when is it not vibes and when is it just, a person?
I'm all in for you taking the piss out of it, as it were, because as you note in your story this week, Tomato Girl Summer, which you can explain what that is, but as you report, it led to a almost 700% increase in linen pant sales. Why? It's when the whole thing, the goofiness becomes commodification. What is this and why did it happen?
Well, because at the end of the day, like everything is now, especially on the internet, a marketing trend, whether you're actually trying to sell something like Hailey Bieber is with her like erotic names for products, or even just trying to sell yourself as someone, as like an inventor of a vibe, or, trying to go viral in some way. But I mean, Tomato Girl Summer is actually insane. It really, when I first saw it, it was just like, oh, I thought it was maybe just, they were just talking about a blush, like a beauty product, like, sure, like you look like you have a tomato smeared on your face. I get it. But then it turned into something more, which was like a woman who's vacationing on the Mediterranean coast and getting a caprese for lunch. So all these explanations for, what it is, you can kind of say anything and then it becomes that. I mean, here's an example. It's really also an obsession with labeling things, but I looked like horrible the other day and I was with my friend and I was like, I'm sorry, I look so bad. And she was like, no, you look cute. You're like tired girl. I'm like, what? She's like, tired girl vibes. And I was like, no, I'm just tired.
Well, my favorite that you created just is a perfect example of how, as you note, tired girl, or could be anything, but as you got in your, can you explain for the readers and listeners, Pastry Boy Summer and who that person is?
Yeah, I would love to. So basically there's this chart that I created based off of all of these beauty trends and vibe trends, as you will, after seeing, latte skin was maybe the last straw. And then I saw a beauty trend that's like messy French girl and then clean French girl. Anyways, there's about 1 million of them. And so I created this chart that has 3 columns. One is something edible or erotic that's kind of influenced by Hailey Bieber being able to sell out products immediately based on making them look like delicious. The second row is an aesthetic, and then the third row is a noun. And you can basically put any of them together, but it's basically very random. Like Pastry Boy Summer was the example I gave in the article, and it's, a guy who doesn't lift weights, but he still might have a good body, and he'd rather just get a coffee and take a walk. And his hair is probably the color of a croissant. Anyways, you can make any of these things, like in quotations, make sense, but ultimately they don't. And it's just a person, and we're obsessed with kind of making a thing out of nothing.
Kazi, I'm going to use a word that will horrify you, but how chooky is it that people like Kamala Harris are even getting on board with this stuff?
I mean, anything to win the election, obviously. But at a certain point, I find it interesting that, it's not even that, in my opinion, the young people even understand what Brad is. And then the older people are kind of trying to just, jump on the trend and utilize it. I find that actually nobody really knows what it is. And when you ask even Charlie XCX herself, she says a bunch of different things that also, she's someone who does this. She's someone who does that. She parties here. She does this. It's it's so meaningless. So at this point, the fact that none of us know what it means and we're all just kind of going with it, it's fine. It's better than if, they also, if younger people knew what it meant and Kamala Harris's team didn't, but they were using it anyway.
Kazi, it's so comforting to me to know that you, as an arbiter, follower, and interpreter of all of this stuff, are just as confused as the rest of us about it. So thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. Thank you, guys.
In other sort of equally bizarre developments, many people think of Sweden as being bucolic and friendly and an exemplar of the Scandi way of living. But in fact, it's a bit more fraught, nefarious, and unpredictable than we ever could have imagined. And we have Ravi Samaya here to talk about how turf war between rival gangs has turned Sweden, of all possible places, into the most violent country in Europe. Ravi is a New York-based writer and editor, as well as the author of The Golden Thread, The Cold War and the Mysterious Death of Dag Hammarskjöld. Welcome, Ravi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Ravi, I think I'm not alone. I've always considered Sweden to be bucolic, beautiful, the epitome of Scandi living. Everyone's kind and friendly, but no, apparently it's the epicenter of gang violence in Europe. So was this like the tourism board doing a good job marketing to me, or what did we miss? How did we get here?
No, it really is that way. It really is absolutely gorgeous. It really is clean and orderly. And there are 2 lovely Volvos in every drive. And my wife, who is Swedish, jokes that everyone has a double oven. So if they want to commit suicide, no one has to wait. To me, it's kind of the price of bucolia, to maintain that perfect surface, to make sure everything's clean and everyone agrees. It takes some sometimes pretty robust measures, and it makes for a society that's good at saying no to the things it doesn't like. The view you're getting from the Swedish tourist board or even when you visit, that's true. But what lies under the surface is quite a rigorous, complicated society. And some of the facets of that society have led us to the capital of gang violence.
The Swedes are known for going to somewhat extreme measures in the past when it comes to various sort of social forces. But can you take us back and give us some context as to where some of the current situation might be stemming from?
So Sweden traditionally has been a very homogenous nation. That's actually why it's maybe a stretch to say it's easy to run. But whenever I hear Americans talking about, why don't we do what Sweden did? My answer always used to be, well, it's 9 million people who all think and look and act the same. Whereas America is 320 million people, and with the greatest will in the world, you can't argue it's a particularly homogenous nation. And so it's always really been 9 million people who very closely identified as Swedes, mostly looked like you would expect Swedes to look. As I say in the story, they were so hard up for immigrants that for a long time, if you went out for an Indian meal, it was often a Chinese family that would be serving it to you because that's all the immigrants they had to some extent. And then, around 2015, around the Syria war, around the kind of waves of displaced people, Sweden decided, okay, now it's our time to step up. In a way, you can argue they sat out World War II. They've sat out much of the tumult of the last 150 or so years. And they thought now was their time to let in a whole bunch of people. They let in 163,000 people, which is just a vast quantity for a nation that's so small. And the bulk of them went to Stockholm and its suburbs, it's a really small city. It's like 500,000 people. It's really not a big place. And just like in America and Britain, these debates are kind of polarized. Kind of half of the political spectrum feels that immigrants are all sort of angels who deserve our sympathy and support. And the other half feels like immigrants are all going to come and steal the headlights out of your car. And of course, neither thing is exactly true. These are just people. Some are wonderful, some are terrible. And no provision was made really for settling them into society, which I certainly, having married into it, found extremely complicated.
Let's talk about one of those people you mentioned. I mean, just to put it in context as you do in your reporting, 163,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but as you note, that would be here in the U.S. the equivalent of about letting in 5 million people. So it is a substantial number if you look at it. But one of the people you mentioned was let in, it was an Iranian-born Kurdish immigrant. Can you tell us about that person and how his influence and impact on Swedish society has transformed the whole country?
This is a fellow called Rawa Majid. In a way, you could argue, if you looked at it through a different lens, he's kind of a pioneer. There hasn't really been any significant organized crime in Sweden, maybe ever. To some small extent, you might have found some groups who are doing things that look like organized crime, but there really hasn't been anything on a nationwide scale. And I think he realized that the country was there for the taking. He realized there was really no obstacle to doing basically whatever he wanted outside of the law, that it's a very trusting nation. It's a very open nation. It's a nation where you don't really have any rivals if you're seeking to perpetrate any kind of gang crime. He had sort of run across the Swedish legal system before, and he had been arrested before, and he got swept up in a giant Europe-wide sting called EncroChat. And EncroChat was an encrypted messaging system that was basically run by law enforcement, and they put it about that this was a great method of avoiding law enforcement to use this messaging app. They swept up hundreds, thousands of potential criminals, including in a small way this guy, Rawa Majid. And on that app, his name was Fox Kurdish. So he started to be known as the Kurdish Fox. And paradoxically, the EncroChat sting was for him an absolute boon because it cleared out what limited rivalry he might have had in Sweden and across kind of Northern Europe was cleared out. He had a free run. It's not clear exactly what his crimes are, what he's accused of by Interpol and the Swedish authorities. It's basically organized crime on a grand scale involving mostly very young participants, drug smuggling, and kind of violence for hire. his gang was kind of the original gang in Sweden. And as these gangs are wont to do, it's since splintered. And he's now in a war with one of his former lieutenants, who's called Ismail Abdo, whose nickname is Strawberry, perhaps because his gang is famous for selling strawberries by the roadside, which is, a traditional bucolic, wonderful Swedish tradition that has kind of been undermined. And the wars between them have meant hand grenades going off in Stockholm suburbs and mothers and children getting caught in the crossfire. It's meant teenagers being tortured and mutilated in graveyards, just the kind of crimes that, they would raise eyebrows in New York and in somewhere as sheltered and sort of previously extremely safe as Sweden. It's absolutely unprecedented.
Yeah, I mean, as you describe him in your story, you describe him as kind of a cross between Pablo Escobar and the Pied Piper, because it's staffed predominantly by the children of immigrants. So it's a multi-layered tragedy, on that point.
Yeah, and one of the things I raised in my story is how difficult it's been for these, especially younger people, to adjust to Swedish society, which is very rigid.
Ravi, why do you think that this story has not been extensively covered, at least as far as I've seen outside of Sweden? I mean, I haven't seen this kind of narrative being reported on very much at all in any of the European papers, certainly not in the American ones.
It's a really interesting question. I think it doesn't fit our image of Sweden. I think, as you guys point out, we like to look at it one way. And in some sense, it's kind of a shining beacon for a certain way of life, or a certain way that we all hope that we could live, a way of living better and more thoughtfully and more cleanly and efficiently and safely, I guess. So I guess to some extent we don't want to. I would say the Swedes don't really want to talk about this at all, because they're aware of their position on the world stage. They're aware of the way in which they're seen. And the last part is it's just really complicated. Like, these gangs are messy. They change all the time. The rivalries shift constantly. It can look like chaos.
Well, Ravi, it's an amazing story. Your reporting is fantastic and you tell it so beautifully. So thank you for it. And thank you for coming on and explaining it in even more detail to us. We so appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Michael, well, this issue of Airmail is really taking us all over the world.
Yeah, this is a must-read story this week. For those of you who do not know Dorothy Stratten, in the late 1970s, she had an almost Marilyn Monroe-like rise. A beautiful young woman who came to L.A., posed for Playboy, and started to make her way into movies, including one directed by Peter Bogdanovich. But at the age of 20, just as her star was rising, her husband murdered her. Her story was later told in part by the movie Star 80, directed by Bob Fosse. But there was a much deeper side of Dorothy's brief, tragic life that has never been told until now. In this week's issue, Dorothy's younger sister, Louise, who was 12 when her sister died, has, with the assistance of Sam Kashner, written a riveting story about their lives growing up, what happened on the last day of her sister's life, and how she, Louise, came to marry Peter Bogdanovich.
We have Sam Kashner here and Louise Stratten to take us through Louise's fascinating story. She's a writer, producer, actress, and the founder of the Dorothy Stratten Foundation, and a frequent collaborator with Peter Bogdanovich, her partner in life and love. She's accompanied by Sam Kashner, a writer at large for Airmail, the author of many of our favorite books, including Life Isn't Everything. Mike Nichols is remembered by 150 of his closest friends. Welcome, Sam and Louise.
Thank you for having me.
Louise, your story in the issue this week is so exquisite, and we're not going to try to summarize it here because there are so many details that really deserve full attention. But I want to talk to you about why you decided that this is the moment to tell your story that has been covered so extensively in the tabloids.
It's never been covered by me. I've never talked about it over the years. As a matter of fact, I'm not even on social media. When I was very, very young, I was thrown into a horrible position where I was suing Hugh Hefner, and Gloria Allred happened to be my lawyer at the time. But I think I was like 15 or something, or 16 years old. I was a deer in headlights at that press conference. And, Peter's passed, and I found out a lot of interesting stuff. It's all going to come out in my book. I just felt like I was learning stuff on my own for myself. And I was horrified. I was horrified for my sister. I was horrified for myself, for my mother, for my brother, for our family. And I felt like at this moment, I was more ready to sort of, in a way, in real time, do a journey for myself while writing this. It's pretty amazing what I've explored. It's been incredible.
In many ways, your late sister, Dorothy, is at the center of this story. And she died so young. I mean, she was 20 years old in 1980 when she died. Tell us a little bit about her.
To describe Dorothy, I mean, she was the most incredible sister in the world. I'm so blessed to have known her. She really gave me my formative years because my mother was really working several jobs, and Dorothy was the one that really was there teaching me my early, moments of whether it's tying my shoelace or teaching me right from wrong. I mean, it was like she had the best sense of humor. I made her laugh a lot, and I think I was a ham just because I loved making her laugh. She was very smart. She was very giving, and there were so many things that people did not know about her as a person, as a young woman. And here I am. I'm the only one left to really tell this story through my lens. And we were really close, spending a lot of time together, even though we were 8 years apart. I was very much exposed to things, I think, at a very young age that probably I shouldn't have been looking back. However, she was very protective over me in those moments and treated me very much with care, respect, but also she trusted me. And that was a big thing. She trusted me with so much. And in a way, I didn't know what to do with the information. I just didn't. And I kept secrets. And I was good at it. And so this is now my moment to reveal secrets that I knew. So, I mean, sister bond, right? I mean, that's kind of what you do. It's what I did.
Well, it's an incredible way of keeping her memory and her legend so much in the present. I mean, but tell us a little bit about the process of writing, shall we say, and how it's felt for you in the wake of Peter's death to bring these issues up into your consciousness again and to be revisiting these parts of your own story.
That's interesting. My own story. I always, felt like I was Dorothy Stratten's sister or Peter Bogdanovich's wife. And I came to a point of like, wait a second, where do I fit into all this? Not to mention that Peter and Dorothy were very much in love during that moment when this happened, the tragedy. I was visiting Dorothy when it happened, and I was on my way to see Paul Snyder, her husband, for the last time for her. I was actually in the car going there, and I just, very unusual of me to want to stay behind. And so thank goodness that not only am I here, I mean, I had survivor's guilt forever, thinking had I gone, maybe I would have saved her. But I realize now that I wouldn't have been here. And so part of my wanting to tell the story is that I am here to tell it. And I feel like I owe it to her to keep her memory alive, but also to give people these beautiful stories that people didn't know otherwise. I mean, that's why I'm partially writing the book is a gift to Dorothy. With Peter, it's like all of a sudden now with him being gone, I've been grieving, but I've also realized that he has given me the most incredible life. And I'm finally sort of finding myself on my own, navigating this new life. And my story is, Dorothy, but it's also just as the tragedy happened and my life was, you think that was just the sort of moment of creating a new life and grieving. All of a sudden I was thrown into this world with Peter Bogdanovich, and that was a whole new chapter. And that's interesting too. But I think that that's what we go into the second part of my story. I'm so glad that I've been able to really be, having this opportunity to share this with Airmail and having people read this story because I've never talked about it.
Yeah, as you just alluded to a moment ago, you were in the car with Dorothy going to see Paul, her husband, and then you have this flash, you want to go not be there, and you go back to be in the house with Peter Bogdanovich, and you're there. And it's a riveting, heartbreaking scene. How old were you that night that she died?
I was 12.
You were 12, and you're there. As you detail in your story, the way you grew up with your mother, you had a legacy of keeping secrets and being quiet. And so she was late, she hadn't showed up. And can you just walk us through that night and share with the listeners what that night was for you?
Like I said, I was in the car with her on the way to see Paul. And we were driving in the car and I had this little moment. I remember being at a red light and looking out the window and having this really little voice that said, "Stay behind." And I did, and she was supposed to pick me up at 2:00 and take me to Capizio to pick up some shoes that I wanted that matched her shoes. And I waited. I was out front waiting, and she never came. And it was not like her. She was always on time. And I just knew something was very wrong. So I ended up going back in the house. It started to get darker, and Peter sat down with us, and he was just saying, looking at the clock, I wonder what, and I felt like I was holding a secret. And he says, "Is there anything you can tell me? Anything you can tell me?" anything. And I said, well, I'm not supposed to say anything, but she went to see Paul. And Peter was eating, I'll never forget this, a pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream, which he did quite a bit, out of the carton with a spoon. And his mouth with ice cream in it and the spoon dropped, just completely dropped, clanked on the table. His blood in his face just went out of his face and just went white. And he didn't say anything. He pushed himself back from the table and stood up and walked out. And I never saw him again until the funeral. I'll never forget that image. Never saw that side of him. He was always very funny, and I didn't know what to make of it. I had to hold that in, and I didn't understand it. And I had nobody to talk to.
Sam, I have a question for you. Working with Louise on this, how much of her story had you been, I mean, obviously you knew her story fairly well, but how many surprises and revelations did you encounter over the course of working with her on this?
Well, nearly everything. What I did know, I knew from Peter's book, but it's a completely different point of view. And there are things that even Peter didn't know that Louise talked about. And so it was revelatory, all of it, really. And I remember we were in a restaurant with Peter and Louise was telling some part of the story that seemed surprising even to Peter, where he seemed upset and concerned about her all over again. It's not hyperbole to say that she has never really talked about this before. And I received a kind of mandate from Peter toward the end of his life, which he said, there's so much about all this that reported in the press and all the gravel kicked up by tabloids and everything, that Louise needs to tell her own story and to set the record straight and also to unburden herself. And, we were all going to try to do that together and to help her. And sadly, she's had to do it on her own. But she was the only person who could do it. And then, of course, Peter died unexpectedly. And she was, almost immediately thrown back on the past, as well as having to deal with the fallouts from his passing. So it was a lot.
So this is just part one. I hope we're going to talk to you guys again about part two and part three and part infinity, because this is really one of the more fascinating, illuminating stories I've read in a really long time. So thank you, first of all, Louise, for sharing it with us and for your openness and willingness to delve back into these painful moments. And Sam, as always, thank you for being Sam.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Okay, Ashley, on a separate note, as we said at the beginning, it's back to school time, but you've got a pretty eye-opening report this week about schools and the new Labour government in the UK and potentially sort of upending one of the country's more revered institution, which is private schools there.
Well, it's a really interesting time to be in the UK because Keir Starmer's Labour Party was elected in July. We have the autumn statement coming out on October 30th, and that's when the government is really going to reveal sort of the state of the economy as well as formalize the initiatives that they have been suggesting throughout their campaign. And the one that really has everyone, in a word, bugging is the 20% VAT, which is a value-added tax on school tuition. Now, in most places of the world, it's a really bad look to be taxing education, but the country's in really dire straits right now. But there's this misnomer out there that the UK is a really wealthy country, right? We have the royal family. We have an incredibly well-preserved city in London that just sort of communicates well-to-do living. But the reality of the country is somewhat different. If you take London out of the equation and just compare the GDP of the UK to Mississippi, the UK is actually poorer than the state of Mississippi. And I think that really surprises people. And that's a big part of the conversation around this 20% value-added tax that's going to be added to private school tuition. Because essentially what it means is a lot of people are going to have to take their children out of private school and put them in the state sector. And when Labour announced this initiative, it was pretty popular. Right now it has about 55% of Britons supporting it.
So it's popular, but he's going to tax this money. He's looking to raise, according to your reporting, $2 billion. What does Starmer want to do with this money then?
Yeah, so he's saying he's going to hire 6,500 teachers and that's going to solve all the problems. But the reality is somewhat different. Public schools, or state schools as they're called in the UK, already tend to be pretty oversubscribed. For example, I was looking at the one in my neighborhood in West London. They receive 4 times the number of applications as spots that are available. And this is not an especially sought after public school. So we're already running against this problem where the state schools don't have resources and all of a sudden they're going to have an influx of students. Some estimates are reporting that 40,000 students are going to have to be moved from the private to the public sector in as early as January. That's another element of this that has have people worried, because initially Labour said that this initiative would be launched in September 2025, which kind of gave schools and parents at least a bit of time to prepare. Now they're moving that up to January, and they're also suggesting that any tuition paid after the Labour Party was elected in July could be subject to the tax, meaning that we could have to go back and pay an extra 20% on the fall term tuition that we've already paid. So, this is just an incredibly stressful thing for a lot of parents all over the UK. You're already seeing schools close, even in central London, to say nothing of what's happening out in the countryside where these schools were already operating on sort of razor-thin margins in the first place. And if they lose, let's say, 10% of students, it's going to be really detrimental to their ability to keep operating.
But actually, as you were saying, in your reporting this week, what's complicated is Keir Starmer and Labour want to raise this money, but even then they're finding it's hard to find people who want to teach, right?
Yeah, I was speaking with the former headmistress of a private school in Chelsea, and she said, this is just a laughable notion, right? The idea that there are 6,500 teachers out there that are highly qualified and looking for jobs. Because she said, even at her private school, which was highly sought after, they had a very difficult time recruiting teachers. A lot of the reasons young people don't want to go into the profession is because it's poor pay. The morale is pretty bad. Workload is very high, and there's a tremendous amount of stress. So the idea that Starmer is just going to fix this problem by hiring all these new teachers is kind of laughable. And especially since, the latest studies show that actually Starmer's initiative is not going to raise as much money as they thought. Originally it thought it was going to be about $2 billion. Now it's looking closer to $1 billion, because guess what? If you have children dropping out of the system, you can't tax them on their tuition. You also have to then pay to educate them in the public system. So anyway, it's a really complicated issue. We're trying to make sense of it all. But one thing is for sure, you're going to see a lot of distressed parents come January.
No, it's a terrific piece of reporting and insight, and I'm grateful to you for bringing it to us, Ashley.
Well, thank you.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Michael, it is the weekend. We definitely need a distraction from all of this. I know you have something you can recommend to us.
I do, really quickly. There's a new show that just dropped on Amazon Prime. It's called A Very Royal Scandal, and it is the look at the disastrous interview that Prince Andrew gave to Newsnight in the UK to the journalist Emily Maitlis a few years ago. You've got Ruth Wilson playing Emily. You've got the incomparable Michael Sheen playing Prince Andrew, and looks into how it came to be, and of course the fallout from it, and the sort of power game between the two of these sides as they negotiate the interview and then do it, and then the fallout from it. It's great. It's a 3-part series. It is streaming on Amazon Prime now.
Well, we wish you all a wonderful weekend. We would like to thank our sponsor, Chanel. It does not get much better than that. Michael, will you please read us out?
The Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley, and our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. Our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music, but most of all, thank you again for joining us.